As spring moves into summer, you'll notice that the wildflowers become absent from the forest. And this is because of the lack of sunlight. So our early spring wildflowers are what we call ephemeral wildflowers. They last for a short period of time, and most of the flowers now are going to be found outside in the fields. There are a few that are left, though, that we're going to talk about today. Two of the flowers we're going to talk about today are both called Solomon's seal. You have the false or starry Solomon's seal, and then you have the true Solomon's seal. They look very similar when you take a look at their leaves. The difference is, where do you find the flower? So this is the true Solomon's seal, and when I lift this up, I'll notice that the flowers hang underneath of the plant. When I take a look at the starry Solomon's seal, I'll notice that the flowers are out on the end of the plant. These plants are called Solomon's seal because supposedly when you take the rootstock and you break it into pieces, the pieces look like the wax seal of King Solomon, who used to seal his letters with an indentation from his ring. Another flower just finishing its bloom period is the wild geranium. This plant is sometimes also called crane's bill. The reason that wild geranium is called crane's bill is because the seed pod looks like the head of a crane. The seeds on this have been known to be thrown from the plant for up to 30 feet. So a good way for the plant to be able to disperse its seeds as it grows in the woods. The leaves are very unique shaped and is easy to identify even when the flowers aren't on the plant. One plant you want to be careful of this time of year are our nettles. These are stinging nettles. They will flower later on with a very indiscriminate green flower. The plant itself you can touch on the surface. It's underneath where you can see the hairs on the bottom side of the leaves and the stem that sting you. One of the best cures can actually be found growing right next to the nettle, and that is what's known as jewelweed or touch-me-not. This is jewelweed or touch-me-not. It's a member of the impatiens family. It is called jewelweed because when water or dew sit on the leaves, it looks like a diamond. It'll ball up. These plants aren't big enough to flower yet, but they can flower with an orange or a yellow flower. You can take the juice from the plant and you can put it on nettle stings, poison ivy, or even mosquito bites, and it helps to alleviate the itch. Waterleaf is now in bloom in the forest. It's called waterleaf because earlier in the spring, it's really easy to identify by the water spots that you see on the leaf. Later in the year, now, as the flower begins to bloom, those water spots fade. But you get this very unique looking flower that has the stamens protruding from the actual flower itself. This is Virginia waterleaf. This time of the year, there are many white-flowered, spiny, bushy plants that are in bloom along the edge of our woodlands, into our woods, and in our pastures and fence rows. So the question is, what are these? Well, they could be blackberries, they could be raspberries, or they could be the invasive Multiflora Rose. So the question is, how do I tell these apart? The Multiflora Rose is the one we want to make sure that we can tell and we can control because it's an invasive species. So as I look at these white-flowered spiny bushes, these briars as we call them, the biggest thing that I usually look at is I look at the stem. The flowers and the leaves are very similar. So this is a Multiflora Rose, named because there are many flowers and many leaflets on it. When I take a close look at the stem, I can see that it's smooth and round and does have many thorns on it. Multiflora Rose can be found looking like a rose bush, or it can actually be found climbing up to the tops of trees. It was brought here and promoted by the Department of Agriculture as a wildlife food and as a living fence row. It was actually brought to Ohio on the farm of Louis Bromfield, which is now Malabar Farms near Mansfield. The reason wildlife like it so well is because these flowers will turn into fruits that are known as rose hips. Those rose hips will ripen in the fall, and wildlife, birds particularly, love to consume them. We as humans also can consume rose hips. The ones on Multiflora Rose aren't that good. They're pretty seedy. But if you've ever had rose hip tea, it's made out of the fruit that comes on the rose bush. Our cultivated rose species typically will have pretty good rose hips that you can just eat as a fruit when they ripen in the fall. So when you're looking for some of the white flower plants, Multiflora Rose is in bloom end of May, first part of June here in Northwest Ohio, and it's something you want to make sure you can control and keep out of your woodlands and your pastures. Blackberries are also in full bloom this time of the year. They bloom just a little later than raspberries, and you can see some of the flowers are disappearing and the fruit is going to start forming where those flowers have been pollinated and died. They do look similar to Multiflora Rose, so how do I tell the difference? Well, the main thing I'm going to look at, since there's no fruit on here right now, is I'm going to take a look at the stem. Now, blackberries and raspberries both take 2 years in order before they set fruit, and so this is a first-year plant. The stem is going to be green, but you'll notice instead of being a circular stem, it's an angular stem. And when you take a look at the leaves, there are less leaves than what you'll find on a Multiflora Rose. Typically 5 on a blackberry, 5 in a bundle. When I look at the older plants that are setting fruit, I'll notice that the stem on these has turned brown, but again, it's going to be angular in shape instead of circular. This is a raspberry. It's finished blooming already for the year, and you can see that the fruit is starting to set on the plant. Now, how do I tell this from a blackberry? Again, the flowers are going to look the same, leaves are going to look the same. Being that it's a bramble, there's going to be spines on the stem. The easiest way to tell is to take a look at the stem. If I look, I'll notice on the raspberry, the stem is completely circular, whereas on the blackberry it was angular. It also has a white coating on it. If I take and I rub my hand along this white coating, you can see that it comes off. Sometimes and often on older plants, the stem is purple. And the same thing, there's a white coating on this purple, and if I rub that off, it'll come off and you can see that purple reddish color underneath. So this is going to be your raspberry, black raspberries. When the fruit is present on a blackberry or a raspberry bush, it's easy to tell the difference between the two. On the blackberry, when you pick the fruit, the stem or the inside remains with the fruit as it's picked off. Blackberries also tend to be larger in size. When we take a look at a raspberry, when the raspberry is picked, the stem stays on the plant itself, and so you'll see that it forms a little hollow, almost a cup shape. So the raspberry is typically smaller in size and more rounded in shape than when we look at the blackberry, which is typically elongated in shape and contains that stem inside. So again, when the fruit is on there, it's easy to tell the difference between blackberries and raspberries. One of the neatest plants in bloom right now is what we call green dragon. It's not very showy when you're walking through the woods, but it has a unique whorl of leaves at the top. And when you look down, if it's in bloom, you can see underneath the leaves is the actual green dragon itself. There's a larger one over here behind these leaves. Pretty neat looking. This is a member of the arum family, just like your jack-in-the-pulpits are. And so the flower itself is what we call a spathe and a spadix. And the flowers are going to be down in the inside there, just like on the jack-in-the-pulpit. You can kind of imagine how it got its name as the green dragon, because it kind of looks like a dragon's head with the smoke billowing out of the front of it. These usually can be found growing down in floodplain areas, and they're going to live for many, many years. The older and the healthier the plant, the larger it's going to be. So that is your green dragon.